World Regions Geography, Part United States and Canada, Part 5. We're continuing with the economy, accumulation, and production of inequality. We were just starting in here. If you're looking at these maps, this is rail density. And you see in 1860, this is the beginning of the Civil War, you have fairly dense along the eastern seaboard and actually pretty extensive here in the Midwest, which at the time was the grain growing region. Also a lot of coal and steel production in this region, but most of your shoes and guns and everything were made back here. So you see pretty dense. In the south, on the other hand, you see very, very few rails because of monoculture. You had a river system with a lot of that were good for moving a lot of products. You didn't need an extensive rail. It wasn't highly industrialized. You didn't have a lot of commodities certain times of the year. You moved your product and that was it. So there wasn't the rail system here that you saw in the north, and that had a big impact on the Civil War. You see 1870, 10 years later, much denser rail system, extremely dense here. And the Transcontinental Railway you see there, this is the Wichita and Topeka Railway. That's the railway that created the big cattle drives that came out of Texas into Kansas up here that we know is in our Western history. These big, huge cattle drives, they were trying to reach these railheads along here to ship to these meat markets in Chicago and farther east. Then in the 1880s, you have the Santa Fe Railroad, the Western. You have the beginnings of the Great Northern Railway. Much more tied in, extremely dense here. Most goods were shipped on rail. Very dense throughout here. You notice here in Texas, just that 10-year period, this is that area, Dallas, Austin, Houston, Fort Worth, that region right there. A lot of goods shipped here. You see the first rail lines running up through Oklahoma, up here into the Midwest, and really extensive over here in Nebraska, and they're shipping corn and grains. And you begin heavily farming this region through here. And then by the 90s, the 1890s, this is rail lines everywhere, shipping. Rio Grande Railway here, Santa Fe, Southern Pacific, through this region, Great Northern up here. The whole country's pretty well tied together, and products are shipped everywhere on the rail. And then here, 1950, which is a big jump of 60 years, very few areas have a few rails. Interestingly, Wyoming doesn't really have a lot of rails along the southern here where the Union Pacific goes through. But other than that, not a lot of rails. I think that's kind of interesting. I think it reflects the cattle culture and the open range. And of course, by 1950, there was an open range, but I think it's pretty interesting. The rest of the country is incredibly connected. 1950, major way you traveled. If you traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast or anywhere in the country where you didn't go by car, you went by rail. If you were going any distance, you often went by rail. And then you see, we jump here to 2009, incredibly less dense. Part of that is reflective of there's less manufacturing in this region through here, but also because of the rise of airfare. So you have airplanes and airports, so people are not traveling on the train as much. They still are shipping goods, and you have a tremendous increase in trucking during this time frame. so that you have a lot less need. You have a consolidation of rail systems, a lot less dense network of rails. Consequently, if you go a lot of places in the country now, there's abandoned rail lines. A lot of times those are turned into nature trails, hiking trails, but there is a dramatic decrease in the density of rail service and rail lines in the United States. The economy, accumulation, production of inequality continued, transforming economies, manufacturing belt. The manufacturing belt basically in the United States or in North America really was the Great Lakes region, in Canada also. If you go to like Detroit, across the river is Canadian city of Windsor. And Windsor is also a huge manufacturing, was a big cart manufacturing area. So the manufacturing belt through the Great Lakes into the northwest part of the United States, and was the huge manufacturing belt. When the economy changed in '74, gas prices changed, and the Arab oil embargo, the manufacturing began to collapse. You had deindustrialization, which is you had the rise of Bruce Springsteen and the type of songs he sung about the Rust Belt. Those if you look at movies from the 70s and 80s, a lot of times they'll talk about the Rust Belt. Deer Hunter has a little bit about that. But the Rust Belt is this ex-manufacturing belt that got deindustrialized. They started closing down. They started losing industries. They started losing jobs. And these factories began to rust. Consequently, the name, the Rust Belt. I mean, the Rust Belt is partly because of not having modernized plants. You had other regions in the world, Korea and Japan, taking over production of certain commodities, steel and other products. Now you're seeing it in China. The Sun Belt, which came after the Rust Belt, and that is basically the movement of this manufacturing, the dispersing of this manufacturing into the southern part of the U.S. and into the western part, where there's more sun, so the weather's better, and land was cheap, generally non-union areas, so that they could move plants down there, not have them unionized, and have lower production costs, be more competitive. This creative destruction is this concept that deals with arising out of this deindustrialization. So it deals with this getting rid of old industries and creating new. So it's creative destruction. We're getting rid of the old, we're creating new types of industries, new ways of doing things, new approaches. It's creative destruction. The new economy is based in, and if you were taking the economic geography class, we'd be talking about Kondrativ curve, and that is about types of economies. The new economy is information technologies, and information technologies are everything to do with computers and mining information and new platforms. How do we collect information? How do we disperse information? Computers, the higher technologies. That's part of whether it's the software or the hardware. A lot of the hardware production, which is relatively simple, it's not intellectually difficult, I guess. The production of technological devices, a lot of that is done in China. The development of the devices themselves, the design of the devices are done a lot of times in the United States. and the software that the devices operate and operate on, a lot of that is done in the United States also. So as we start into that, we have that wealth inequality, and the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, but it also has one of the highest. I mean, there's a thing called American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism says, all these rules apply to everybody else, but don't really apply to us. And one of the things is if you look at wealth inequality in the U.S., it compares to third world countries. It compares to developing countries like China, not to highly industrialized economies like Western Europe. Income inequality is not only gender-based, but it's ethnic-based. If you are non-white, you're probably going to earn less than a person that is white. If you're female, you're going to earn less than a male. In the U.S., it's about, I think, 77 cents on the dollar for women. Occupy Wall Street, it was that movement a few years ago, originated in Canada. It tried to address or bring to attention the wealth distribution issue and the income distribution issue in the U.S. The global economic crisis, which took place in 2008, was brought about by bank failures and a lack of government control. You had economic instruments that were broke into many parts, and those parts were sold on the market. You had things like debt that was very marginal, that had been bought and sold as good debt, and when the economy turned south, that began to unravel. You had the housing bubble burst. What we saw, luckily, the government took some steps that managed to stem a lot of that, and we can agree or disagree with whether they should or shouldn't, whether Keynesian economics should be applied here. But the bottom line is, had they not done that, the collapse probably would have been as great as the Great Depression, and maybe for as long lasting. The real risk right now is probably that we would have stagflation, which is inflation without a growth in income. It's been going on in Japan for about 20 years now. Personal and government debt was high. Mortgage crisis. You had a lot of mortgages out there where there were inflated prices. Housing prices in the Central Valley were some of the hardest hit in the country. It's just starting to recover. We're having some recovery. The home prices are starting to grow again in the valley, but they're not anywhere near the levels that they were. The effects on Canada's economy. Canada was bolstered by the oil production, but since oil prices have collapsed in the last year, that has hurt Canada's economy, and it's going to be tough to see where the Canadian economy will end up within the next few years.